This program, the Witness Webcast, is brought to you by Crucible of Faith Ministries.
Hello and welcome everyone to The Witness, where we defend the truth of God's Word while discerning the times that we live in. We are happy you have joined us. For more resources to build your faith and encourage your walk with Jesus, please visit our website at www.crucibleoffaith.ca. There, you will find a host of resources that will refresh and build your faith in Christ. And now, here's your host, Raymond Viswanathan.
This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello and welcome to The Witness, where we defend the truth of God's Word while discerning the times that we live in. I'm your host, Raymond Viswanathan, and I'm so happy that you've joined us today. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, not too long ago, set off the implementation of emergency orders across Canada, the nature of which were never before experienced in the history of our nation. Now, what has happened in the last 2 years or so has never before taken place in our generation, either in scope or in size. And it upended everything. People lost their jobs, many died, many businesses went into bankruptcy, and even churches were closed, and some for good. Equality and freedom in Canada are fundamental rights protected for all Canadians under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the central element of constitutional law in Canada, and it is considered the most significant part of the Canadian Constitution. The Charter protects individual rights and freedoms for all Canadians, and its provisions must be enforced by the courts in Canada. Now, what are these rights and freedoms that are protected under the Charter? They include the freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and the right to a fair trial and so on. But post-pandemic, have our rights and freedoms under the Charter been worn down or perhaps eroded? Now, our special guest is a constitutional law expert in Canada, and he joins us on our program today to answer these very important questions, and perhaps also to allay our fear that not all is lost. Now, if you're looking to understand your rights and freedoms under the Charter today, then this program will be important for you. Mr. John Carpay is the founder and president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and he, of all people across Canada, has been at the forefront of this massive undertaking of fighting for and defending the equality and the freedoms for all Canadians under the Charter. He joins us on our program today from Calgary, Alberta, and in his personal capacity to help us to understand where we as Canadians are with respect to our equality and freedom under the Canadian Constitution and specifically under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Mr. John Carpay, we are very honored to have you on our program today, sir. Welcome to The Witness.
Well, thank you. The honor is mine. Glad to be here with you.
Thank you, John. John, there's so much that I want to discuss with you today, and I hope we'll have enough time to do this. But let's start off our discussion with what may have changed for Canadians in the last few years with regard to our rights and freedoms under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, please. And I have a few questions for you, John. My first question is this. In your view, did the COVID-19 pandemic affect the rights and freedoms that all Canadians enjoy under the Charter? What do you think, John?
The answer is yes, massively and severely. When the government says that you cannot have Christmas dinner with your mother or with your son, that's a violation of your freedom of association. When the government closes churches, as the BC government did for many months, even while keeping bars and gyms and restaurants open, that's also a violation of religion and conscience when the government shuts down churches or places unjustified restrictions. When you can get a ticket for peacefully protesting outdoors, which has happened in most provinces, if not every province, people have gotten $1,000 tickets just for peacefully assembling outdoors. That's a violation of a charter right to peaceful assembly. When you have government bodies like the College of Physicians and Surgeons or the College of Nurses and Midwives going after their members, shutting down scientific debate by declaring that truth is pre-established and we cannot question it, we cannot discuss it, that's a violation of freedom of expression, where doctors are in fear of losing their license simply for engaging in the scientific process. When the government says that you must get injected with a new vaccine or else you will lose your job or get expelled from university, that is a violation of the charter right to bodily autonomy. When the government makes it illegal or difficult to travel within Canada, and imposes all kinds of crazy restrictions on people returning to Canada, that's a violation of the charter mobility rights. So many of these rights and freedoms in the charter were severely violated by the federal and provincial governments starting in March of 2020.
John, do you think the emergency measures and public health orders that were implemented during the pandemic were legally justified under the Charter? And I think you've answered in part this question. And if no, would you please expand? What should Canadians understand about the emergency measures and the public health orders?
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does allow federal and provincial governments to violate rights and freedoms, provided that they demonstrate with persuasive evidence that the violation is going to do more good than harm. Now, there's actually very complicated legal tests that would, take five or 10 minutes to go through all the different components. So I am simplifying it. But the government has to show that if they, take away your right to have Christmas dinner with your mother or with your daughter, that measure is actually going to do more good than harm. Or if they're shutting down peaceful outdoor protests, they have to show with medical evidence, scientific evidence, that restriction on freedom is going to do more good than harm. And that's the way it's supposed to work so far. And I'm sure we'll get to this within the next half hour. But so far, a lot of the court rulings, the judges are not doing their duty to take a hard look, serious look at the evidence of lockdown harms. So in other words, we know that there are significant lockdown harms. We've had increases in mental health issues, loneliness, depression, anxiety. We've had massive economic impacts, people thrown out of work, people's businesses being driven into bankruptcy by the government and the lockdown measures, schools closed, illegal to connect. We know from medical research that there's a deep human need to connect in person. You look at how many millions of dollars people spend every Christmas to fly to a different province or a different country. Why? Because, a Zoom Christmas is not the same as an in-person. There's no substitute for a hug, connecting face to face. There's vast medical evidence that is very harmful for us to not be meeting with people in person. So that's just one example of a lockdown harm. And we have yet to have a court decision where the judges are actually looking at the lockdown harms, looking at the benefits that may have come. I'm not convinced that there were any, but it's possible. But the courts are supposed to balance that evidence and then look at whether these measures are doing more good than harm. Thus far, they have not done that.
Yeah, that was my next question, John. It's been 2 to 3 years since the height of the pandemic, and in retrospect, I was going to ask you, how well, in your view, did the Canadian courts balance public health concerns and individual rights? Can you help us to understand what were the legal principles that guided these court decisions, if ever there were any? What's your view, John?
Well, we've had a very high degree of deference on the part of judges that I've not seen previous to 2020. Previous to 2020, we've had the charter now for about 41, coming on 42 years. And there have been many court rulings in the past 40 years where the courts have struck down a government law, a government policy, a decision of a government body, and they've struck these down, and they've always treated the government and the claimant as two equal parties, and they've weighed the evidence, and they've often ruled against the government. And what's happened here, I think, is that the politicians and the media created a lot of fear, exaggerated fear. I mean, you can have a justified fear, if you're in the jungle and there's a tiger there, you have a right to, it's legitimate and normal to feel fearful. However, we can also fall into excessive fear where people are exaggerating a problem. And so what happened in March of 2020 was that Dr. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College in London and some other scientists and lots of politicians, they claimed that COVID would be just as bad as the Spanish flu of 1918 and that tens of millions of people would die. So that was not true. Was proven false very early on. They also claimed that COVID was a threat to everybody, which has also been completely disproven. It's harmless for children, and if you're under 70, the risk of dying or being harmed by COVID is about as high as the risk of dying or getting harmed by driving a car. And people don't think twice about getting into their car to drive to go shopping or drive to go see a friend. But the risk of death or harm from driving a car is the same as your risk of death or harm from COVID if you're under 70. So it was a serious disease for elderly people, people that were already had emphysema and heart disease and various conditions. So everybody got put into a state of fear, and unfortunately, I think Canadian judges also got put into the same state of fear. And when we're afraid, we don't think. Right? That's human nature. If you're terrified, you want a quick solution. You want somebody else to tell you what to do, and you want to obey, because that's what our panic response is. And so, what's happened in the last 3.5 years is that the judges, instead of doing what they did previously, which is to really take a hard look at the evidence, they've said, well, this is a crisis. This is the worst pandemic in a century. Therefore, all the government needs is they need to have some science on their side. It does not need to be really persuasive. If the government has a little bit of science to support it, then we just have to defer to the government. And that's been the approach of the courts in the last 3.5 years.
So, John, correct me if I'm wrong. With regard to balancing public health measures and individual rights, it seems as if, hearing from you, John, that this balance was a little lopsided, would you say?
Yeah, very, very much so.
Okay. John, let's move our conversation on today to something that I believe weighs very heavily on the minds and the hearts of many people in Canada today. And not just for people in the church, but for all Canadians, irrespective of their faith persuasion. And I want to get your perspective, John, on what concerns you today about potential events that may transpire for us in the months and years ahead. We've seen the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been about 2 and 3 years behind us. But looking forward, what do you think were those restrictions on our freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, even the freedom of worship, as a consequence of the pandemic? Were they justified in your view? And what are the implications of these restrictions as they bear upon our rights under the Charter going forward? What do you think, John?
Well, it's still a problem today. In British Columbia, in spite of significant understaffing in the healthcare system, there are thousands of doctors and nurses who are prohibited from going back to work tomorrow because they made a decision 2 years ago to not get injected with the COVID vaccine. And so we have this in other provinces as well, that people are still not allowed to go back to work. I think the challenge for Canadians, we tend to be polite and we tend to be deferential to authority. And that can be a good thing, but like all good things, if you take it too far, a good thing becomes a bad thing. It's very clear that we are to obey the governing authorities, and we do need law and order. We cannot live in a country where everybody just chooses to obey only the laws that they like. We would have chaos and anarchy. So there's a place for authority, but there's also when authority oversteps its boundaries and closes churches and inflicts harm on people by preventing them from getting together in person without a strong medical or scientific justification for that, because it's all based on this exaggerated fear of a real problem. Then you've got a problem, and I think Canadians need to really, you have to balance the need to be polite, which is good, and the need to obey the authorities, which is good. You also have to balance that with a love for truth and with courage, that in some situations you say, well, what the authorities now are demanding is fundamentally unjust. There's a verse in the book of Acts that I'm sure you're familiar with, where the apostles were told that they were not to preach the gospel, and they said, we're going to obey God and not the laws of men, or words to that effect. I'm not quoting it perfectly. So there's a time and a place where people need to say no to the authorities when laws are fundamentally unjust.
Thank you, John. John, my second question, with regard to what may come in the days, months, and years ahead, relates to the expanding use of technology. Now, in relation to our right to privacy that is protected under the Charter. John, what must we understand about the boundaries that the Charter draws as a line in the sand with regard to what governments can or cannot do in terms of data collection, sharing, digital IDs, contact tracing, surveillance? John, what are your thoughts?
Well, the Charter does protect a right to privacy that's been recognized by numerous court decisions over the years. Now, it's one thing if you switch from a hard copy driver's license to a driver's license that's on your phone. In and of itself, that's not necessarily bad. Some people, they prefer to have everything on their phone, so you don't have to carry a little plastic card in your wallet. What becomes problematic is when you have centralized collection of data where the government knows it's not just a registry of driver's licenses or a registry of passports or a criminal records registry for those who have been convicted of crimes. Some of that data gathering is necessary for proper functioning of society, but it becomes a problem if the government in one place has your medical data and your social media comments, your political views, tracking of geography, where you go, who you associate with, where you're driving to, or even worse, if you get central bank digital currency, the government can track every purchase that you made, and they know that you went to Walmart on Tuesday morning and spent $12, and you went to Safeway on Wednesday afternoon and spent $23. So we have a petition on the website of the Justice Centre calling for strengthening of legislation to protect the privacy of Canadians. If we don't do that, we're going to end up like communist China, which has a social credit system whereby if you say something bad about the government on social media, you're going to find yourself unable to get onto a bus or a train or an airplane. And this is very dangerous. The technology is there to turn us into communist China tomorrow. The technology is there. So Canadians have to be very vigilant and make it very clear to their politicians that we want our privacy rights protected.
John, how far are we along between today and a social credit system that you identified that's something like in China? How far are we along, John? How many years, how many months?
Well, we're very far along. The government did implement this to a considerable extent when we had the vaccine passports. And now all of a sudden, even if you did get the COVID shot, you have to violate your own medical privacy and give personal, confidential, private information to a hostess at a restaurant before getting seated at the restaurant. You have to flash this personal, private, confidential medical information to a total stranger. And so we saw that already. We know the government has this, the technology is there. In terms of whether this is going to be the case in 6 months or 6 years or 6 decades or never, that really depends on Canadians to stand up for and speak out for their own right to privacy. Because most politicians are followers, not leaders. And if it's made clear to politicians that we cherish our privacy, we don't want our privacy violated, if that's very clear to the politicians, then they're not going to move ahead on it.
John, you mentioned that you have an ongoing petition on your website. For the sake of our listeners, can you tell us where we can go to sign up?
www.jccf, so Justice Center Constitutional Freedoms, jccf.ca, and the petition should be fairly easy to find there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Now, for our listeners who are tuning into this program, you will see John Carpay's biography, and in his biography on our website, along with this interview today, you will find all the information you need on where you can uh, join John Carpay in his podcast, including his petitions on his website, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Now, John, let's move on. My next question, I have to ask this question to you quite bluntly, and it is this: can governments, under the Charter, legally mandate vaccinations? And if yes, can you help us understand what issues under the Charter would arise in this case?
So under the charter, the government could legitimately make vaccinations mandatory, as they were effectively in 2021. They were mandatory. They were not forced in the sense that you've got four guys wearing white lab coats that are pinning you down while the fifth one injects you. They were not forced vaccinations, but they were mandatory in the sense that you were punished and turned into a second-class citizen. You could not get onto an airplane, or you couldn't keep your job, you couldn't attend university. Now, mandatory vaccinations could be justified under the charter if you had something that was truly as bad as the Spanish flu of 1918, and if the vaccine, if there was long-term safety data to confirm that you're not going to get myocarditis or suddenly drop dead even though you've been healthy all your life. So if you had a disease as bad as Spanish flu of 1918, and if the vaccines were truly effective, and if there wasn't an alternative to vaccination in terms of letting the virus spread amongst stronger and healthier people, under certain conditions, yes, it could be justified. But under what we've had the last 3 years with a virus that was deadly for elderly and sick people, but not a serious threat for 90% of the population, under those circumstances, you could not justify mandatory vaccinations under the charter.
Thank you. Thank you. John, in your view, are there some scenarios or projections that you see could transpire for Canadians in the years and months ahead, whether positive, whether negative, with regard to our equality and rights under the Charter? What do you think, John?
It's really up to Canadians as to whether we exercise our charter freedoms of conscience, religion, expression, and be involved in the democratic process. There's an old French proverb that says, if you don't do politics, then politics will be done unto you. And the way democracy works in practice is that it rewards the people who are the most active in the democratic process, and it punishes people who are not active. And so you see, for example, there's school boards all over Canada where you have elected school board trustees who want to expose children to inappropriate or age inappropriate sexual content. They want to expose children to transgender ideology. They want to confuse vulnerable children and tell boys that they, you're not really a boy, you might be a girl, and tell girls that, well, you might be a boy. You have these elected school board trustees who are pushing this and the parents don't agree with it at all. Why do we have this situation? Well, it's because people are apathetic. They say, well, I'm not going to be involved in the school board election. I'm not going to run as a candidate. I'm not going to work on the campaign of a candidate. I'm too busy. I'm not interested. And it leaves the door wide open for radical ideologues who have a very pernicious, very destructive agenda. They take power legally. Why? Because Canadians are not involved in politics. So, what's going to happen in Canada in 6 months or 2 years or 5 years? It really depends on the degree or the extent to which Canadians roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of being really engaged in the democratic process at the school board level, municipal level, provincial, and federal.
Okay. John, I'm going to take that question one step further. Let's say status quo doesn't change. People remain apathetic, couldn't care less, etc., etc. They don't want to participate. They're too busy. Under those conditions, would you offer your view? What might happen in the years ahead, months, years ahead? Where do you think we'll be?
We're going to move if Canadians don't change their ways and become more informed, more aware, more active in the democratic process. If the status quo, as you say, if we keep this current level of non-involvement, we will step by step head towards communist China. We see today, for example, in British Columbia, there's a nurse by the name of Amy Ham who is being prosecuted through disciplinary proceedings by the British Columbia College of Nurses and Midwives. Why? Because she said publicly that there are only two genders, and because she said publicly that women are entitled to safe spaces, change rooms and bathrooms where biological men should not be allowed in. For having said this publicly, she's been prosecuted for more than 2 years, and the Justice Center is providing her with the legal representation. But this is just an example of what's going on now, where you could lose your license to work as a nurse or as a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, a teacher, simply for saying that there are two genders and that women deserve to have safe spaces. So we are more and more going to head into this Chinese social credit system unless we assume responsibility as citizens and get more engaged in the democratic process.
John, there are many people, not just within the church, but quite frankly, people of all faiths, all people of all faiths across our nation, who are trying very hard to make sense, John, of the confusion that seem to be crushing our families, our communities. And the pandemic is just one of those issues, John. Now, if you could say one thing or something, not just to the church, but to all people of all faiths, what would you tell them? If there was something that you could share with our listeners, John, that could allay our fears about what we've just discussed, what you've just shared with us in our program, or perhaps to give us some comfort or confidence that not all is lost. John, what would you say?
Well, tyrants look for slaves, and slaves look to be governed by tyrant. And so we have to transform our society so that individual citizens assume responsibility for their lives. In particular, we need to assume responsibility for the education of our children. We've been a bit lazy. Canada's had it very good from 1945, being on the winning side of World War II. For many decades, we became one of the most prosperous, wealthy countries in the world. We've had it compared to other countries or compared to people living in other periods of history. We've had it very easy. And so we've become lazy and we've said, well, the schools are going to look after my children's education. I don't need to pay attention to that. The government's looking after my healthcare. I don't need to think about that. And the whole culture has become too oriented on pursuing only pleasure and comfort and convenience and prosperity. And those things are good things. So prosperity, comfort, pleasure, convenience are good things. But if that's the only thing that your culture is focused on, so we've had a cultural rot that has set in the last 50 years, and it's going to take a lot of hard work to re-educate ourselves into recognizing that we need to pursue not just material prosperity, but we need to pursue virtue, and we need to assume responsibility for becoming properly educated about our charter rights and freedoms. So it's a huge, big education project that's going to take decades, I think, to really turn things around in the country. But it's, the journey of 1,000 miles has to begin with a single step. So we have to start today, small steps, and really acquire that knowledge of the free society and our rights and freedoms and responsibilities.
Okay. Thank you, John. Now, John, this is a relatively short program, and we've nearly come to the end of our interview with you today. And we hope to have you come on our program again in the future. And in a few minutes, John, we will be closing this program. But before we go there, I'd like to ask you a few more questions, John, if you don't mind, that I did not previously share with you. Now, these questions that I want to ask you in a few moments were designed so that our listeners tuning in to our program today will understand what exactly you do at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and why you are doing this. Now, John, you have been criticized, you have been insulted, you've been sanctioned, rightly or wrongly, mocked, and even scorned by some quarters in our society. Yet, you get up every day, you go to work, you manage the operations of the JCCF admirably, and you do so much else that many people in Canada are either unable or unwilling to do. You stand fighting for the rights of for all Canadians, whether it's a sunny day outside or a blithering cold winter day in Calgary, day in, day out. Now, John, I have to ask you, why do you do this?
Well, I've always had a love for justice and a love for freedom. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I was born in 1967, and the country I grew up in had a lot more freedom, a lot more common sense. It was not a paradise. It was not a utopia. You know, we've always had problems. But when I see where we're at today, especially on freedom of expression, I find it very troubling that you have this cancel culture and where people, instead of engaging in debate and refuting what they believe to be an incorrect opinion, what they say instead is, "Oh, you should not be allowed to speak because that's offensive." And that's a very different culture. When I was growing up, if somebody said something that you disagreed with, you would either ignore the person or you would engage in debate. You would say, "Well, you're wrong, and let me tell you why you're wrong." And we had debate. And it hardly ever happened that somebody said, "Oh, she should not be allowed to say that. He should lose his job over saying that." There's an understanding that we had freedom of expression, and it's still there. The fact that we're doing this interview and it's going to be on the internet means we still have a lot of freedom of expression. But what motivates me is that I want a free and virtuous society where citizens assume their responsibilities to raise and educate their children, to learn history. Because if somebody is ignorant of history, you can persuade them of anything. We cannot judge good ideas from bad ideas if we're ignorant of history. What inspires me is my grandparents in the Netherlands. They lived through the Nazi occupation. The Germans invaded and took over the Netherlands, occupied it for 5 years, took away everybody's rights and freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion and conscience were curtailed, freedom of association, peaceful assembly, everything. And they lived through a dark time and they persevered. And they did so even though they didn't know how long the occupation would last. For all they knew, it could have lasted for 10 years or for 50 years. It ended up being 5 years. They kept on going. And so I'm determined to have a just and free society for my children and grandchildren if that ever happens. And I'm a big believer in the saying that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. So I I run the Justice Center to fight for those ideals, and we have a team of 9 lawyers and 5 paralegals and 5 communication staff, and we have administrative staff. And all of these lawyers and paralegals and communication staff are just as dedicated as I am to fighting for the rights and freedoms of Canadians.
Thank you, John. Thank you. My second and last question to you is this. From what you have seen, from what you have experienced so far across our nation, our own communities, our own families, and when you think, John, about your own family, your own children, John, I have to ask you, what keeps you up at night?
Well, you know, you, but by worrying, we cannot add a single hour to our lives. So I struggle to, I'm always struggling to not worry, but I try hard, but then I fall into the trap and I worry, which is useless. The things that keep me up at night, I worry that there's not going to be enough people that are going to rise to the challenge and fight back. Uh, I worry about the revenue stream for the Justice Center because, when we get more money, we hire more lawyers and paralegals. When we have less money, we have to lay off lawyers and paralegals. So we kind of go up and down. So sometimes I worry, are we going to get enough money to sustain our operations? Because we depend entirely, like your ministry, it's all based on voluntary donations. So yeah, I try not to worry, but I do worry, are there going to be enough people that are going to stand up for truth and justice and freedom? I worry about that.
Thank you, John. John, we've come to the end of our program. You've been so kind to consent to come on our program. And before we close, John, I want to leave the last word to you, John. What would you say?
Well, the honor is mine. I enjoy our discussions, and I'd be happy to do this again in the future. And I just want to thank people for their concern and compassion. I think if you're listening to this, you care about Canada. You care not only about your own future, but you care about the future of your loved ones, and that could be children, grandchildren, other loved ones. So I want to say thanks to everybody that's concerned enough to tune into this. And I guess I would ask people to rise to the occasion, do your part, do your duty, do what you're being called to do to turn this country around.
Thank you, John. Now, if you're listening to our program today and you would like to know more about John Carpay, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, then I would encourage you to please read John's full biography, which is attached to his interview on our program, and that will be available on our website. And there you will find all the information that you will need on how you can follow the work of the JCCF, how you can access their news releases, their columns and opinions, and their newsletter, The Docket. Now, I want to thank you all for joining us on The Witness today for this very timely and rather important program with Mr. John Carpay. And I hope that it has been of some help to you. And join us again next time on our program where we will defend the truth of God's Word while discerning the times that we live in. Thank you for joining us. God bless you.
Thank you for tuning into The Witness. We trust you have been blessed. If you would like to share your thoughts or comments with us, we would love to hear from you. Please visit our website at www.crucibleoffaith.ca. Go to our blog at the end of this program and submit your comments there. Thank you. Please also consider partnering with us and supporting this ministry financially. Crucible of Faith Ministries was undertaken as a bold step of faith to meet an unprecedented challenge, especially at such a time as ours and in our nation of Canada. Your partnership with us will go a long way to help us meet this challenge and take the gospel of Christ Jesus to our nation and the rest of the world. You can give securely on our website at www.crucibleoffaith.ca. Go to our partner support link there, and then follow the prompts. Alternatively, if you wish to send us a check, please write that out to Crucible of Faith Ministries and mail it to 400 1231 Pacific Boulevard, Vancouver, British Columbia, postal code V6C0E2, Canada. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, the Lord bless and keep you.